Margaret Robinson stepped off the train at Mobile's Union Station, her gloved hand clutching a telegram that had arrived 3 days prior. The afternoon Alabama heat pressed against her like a physical force, causing beads of sweat to form beneath her high-necked blouse. July in Mobile was unforgiving, especially for someone accustomed to Boston's milder summers. "Mrs. Robinson?" A man in a grey suit approached, hat in hand. "William Hayes, your late uncle's attorney. My deepest condolences for your loss." Margaret nodded, studying the man who'd arranged her unexpected inheritance. "Thank you for meeting me, Mr. Hayes. I must admit, I barely knew Uncle Charles. We corresponded occasionally, but I haven't seen him since I was a child." Hayes signaled to a porter to collect Margaret's trunks. "Your uncle was a private man, especially after his wife and son passed in 18 during the influenza outbreak, but he always spoke highly of you." They climbed into a waiting automobile, the leather seats hot to the touch. As they drove through Mobile's oak-lined streets, Margaret watched the Spanish moss sway in the humid breeze, hypnotic and melancholic. "The house is quite substantial," Hayes explained. "Built in 1887 by your grandfather. It's in the old Dauphin Way district, one of the finest homes in Mobile. Your uncle's will was specific. The entire estate passes to you, his only living relative." Margaret frowned. "It's very generous, but I don't understand why. My husband has a good position in Boston. We have no intention of relocating." Hayes cleared his throat. "The will stipulates you must live in the house for at least 3 months before deciding whether to sell. Your uncle was adamant about this condition." The automobile turned onto a street lined with grand antebellum homes, finally stopping before an imposing Victorian mansion. 3 stories of weathered red brick rose behind a wrought iron fence, with a broad veranda wrapping around the first floor. The windows were shuttered against the heat, giving the house a closed, secretive appearance. "We've prepared the house as best we could," Hayes said as they approached the front gate. "Mrs. Jenkins comes daily to clean and cook, though she doesn't stay past dusk." Margaret was about to question this peculiar arrangement when a sound drifted from an upstairs window, a child's laughter, light and innocent. She paused, looking up. "I thought the house was empty." Hayes followed her gaze, his expression unreadable. "It is, Mrs. Robinson. No one has lived here since your uncle's passing 3 months ago." Margaret stared at the shuttered window. The laughter had stopped. Only the buzzing of cicadas and distant church bells filled the heavy afternoon air. "Welcome to Mobile, Mrs. Robinson," Hayes said, unlocking the gate. "Welcome home." The massive oak door creaked open, releasing a rush of stale air. Margaret stepped into the foyer, where a grand staircase curved up to the 2nd floor. Crystal prisms from a chandelier cast rainbow patterns across the oriental carpets and mahogany furniture. Despite the heat outside, a peculiar chill permeated the house. "The electrical wiring was installed in 1915, Hayes explained, flipping a switch that illuminated wall sconces. "Your uncle was quite progressive about modernizing, though he preserved most of the original features." Margaret wandered into the parlor, running her fingers along a dusty piano. Family portraits hung on floral-papered walls, stern-faced men and women in Victorian dress, their eyes following her movements. One small portrait showed a boy of about 8, with solemn eyes and a sailor suit. "Is this my cousin, Uncle Charles's son?" Hayes nodded. "Edward, lovely child. Such a tragedy." A grandfather clock in the hallway struck 5, its chime reverberating through the empty rooms. "I should go," Hayes said, placing a ring of keys on a side table. "Mrs. Jenkins has prepared supper in the kitchen. She'll return in the morning around 8. "Mr. Hayes," Margaret called as he reached the door. "Why doesn't Mrs. Jenkins stay past dusk?" The attorney paused, his hand on the doorknob. "Local superstition, I suppose. Nothing to concern yourself with. Good evening, Mrs. Robinson." After he left, Margaret explored the ground floor. The formal dining room, with its massive table set for 12, the library lined with leather-bound books, the sunroom overlooking a garden gone wild with creeping jasmine and wisteria. Eventually she found the kitchen, where a covered plate waited beside a note. "Welcome home, Mrs. Robinson. There's cold tea in the icebox. Mrs. Jenkins." After eating, Margaret carried a kerosene lamp upstairs, though the electric lights worked perfectly well. Something about the warm glow felt safer as darkness settled outside. The master bedroom was prepared with fresh linens, but the air felt heavy, as if the room had been sealed for years rather than months. She unpacked, placing her husband Richard's photograph on the bedside table. He'd join her in 2 weeks, once his business affairs were arranged. Until then, she was alone in this strange inheritance. As she prepared for bed, Margaret heard it again. A child's laughter, followed by the patter of small feet in the hallway. She froze, hairbrush in hand. "Hello?" she called, opening the bedroom door. The hallway stretched empty in both directions, pale moonlight filtering through a stained glass window at the far end. "Is someone there?" Margaret grabbed her lamp and investigated the second floor. 4 bedrooms, all unoccupied, their furniture draped in white sheets. The third floor remained unexplored, its door at the top of the narrow servants' staircase locked for now. Returning to her room, Margaret noticed the photograph of Richard had been turned face down. She righted it with trembling fingers and climbed into bed, leaving the lamp burning low beside her. Just as exhaustion began to overcome her unease, a whisper came from somewhere in the darkened room. "She's in my bed, Mama." Margaret sat upright, her heart pounding. "Who's there?" Only silence answered, broken by the distant moan of a ship's horn from the harbour and the persistent chirping of crickets outside her window. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of children playing hide-and-seek in endless hallways, calling her name from behind locked doors. Morning sunlight streamed through the bedroom windows, dissipating the previous night's fears. Margaret convinced herself the strange sounds had been the product of an overactive imagination, exhaustion from travel, and an unfamiliar house settling. She dressed and descended to find Mrs. Jenkins in the kitchen, a stout woman in her 60s with iron-grey hair tied severely beneath a kerchief. She was preparing breakfast, humming softly to herself. "Good morning, Mrs. Jenkins," Margaret said, causing the woman to start visibly. "Goodness, Mrs. Robinson, didn't hear you come down." Mrs. Jenkins placed a hand over her heart. "You gave me quite a turn. How did you sleep?" "Well enough, thank you," Margaret lied, "though I thought I heard noises during the night." Mrs. Jenkins's hands stilled over the biscuit dough she was kneading. What sort of noises? Like children playing or laughing? The wooden spoon in Mrs. Jenkins's hand clattered to the floor. She bent quickly to retrieve it, avoiding Margaret's gaze. "Old houses make all manner of sounds, ma'am. Wind in the chimney, pipes expanding, nothing to fret about." She placed a cup of coffee before Margaret. "Mr. Hayes mentioned you'd be wanting a tour of the property today. There's nearly an acre of gardens, though they've grown wild since your uncle took ill." As they ate breakfast, Margaret tried a different approach. "How long did you work for my uncle, Mrs. Jenkins?" "Going on 30 years. Started when young Master Edward was just a baby." Her voice softened at the boy's name. "It must have been terrible, losing both Edward and his mother to the influenza." Mrs. Jenkins crossed herself. "The Lord gives and takes according to his plan, though sometimes that plan is hard to understand." After breakfast, they toured the gardens. Behind the house stood a small family cemetery enclosed by a wrought-iron fence. Graves of Robinsons dating back to the 1850s. The newest stones belonged to Eliza Robinson, 1878-1918, Edward Robinson, 1910-1918, and Charles Robinson, 1868-1921. "Did my uncle ever remarry after losing his wife and son?" Margaret asked. Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. "He became a different man after they passed, locked himself away in his study for days, started drinking heavily." She hesitated. "He claimed he could still hear Edward playing in the house, especially at night." "And did you ever hear anything?" The housekeeper's eyes darted toward the house, then back to Margaret. "It's not my place to say, ma'am." As they returned inside, Margaret noticed a door beneath the main staircase. "What's in there?" "Just storage," Mrs. Jenkins answered quickly. Nothing of interest, but something in the woman's tone made Margaret suspicious. While Mrs. Jenkins prepared lunch, she returned to the hallway and tried the door. It was locked. She made a mental note to check the keyring Hayes had left. That afternoon, Margaret wrote to Richard, describing the house but omitting her uneasiness. As she sealed the envelope, she heard Mrs. Jenkins gathering her things in the kitchen. "Will you be comfortable alone tonight, Mrs. Robinson?" the housekeeper asked, already donning her coat despite the early hour. "Of course," Margaret replied, walking her to the door, "though I'm curious why you don't stay later." Mrs. Jenkins paused on the threshold, the dying sunlight casting long shadows across the porch. "There are stories about this house, ma'am, things that decent folks don't discuss." She lowered her voice. "If you hear the children tonight, don't answer them. And whatever happens, don't open that door under the stairs." Before Margaret could demand an explanation, Mrs. Jenkins hurried down the path, her figure quickly swallowed by the gathering twilight. After Mrs. Jenkins's departure, the house seemed to exhale, as if relieved to be free of her restraining presence. Margaret stood in the foyer, listening to the subtle creaks and sighs of the old structure. The grandfather clock ticked solemnly, marking seconds that somehow seemed longer than they should be. Margaret approached the door beneath the staircase, running her fingers along its frame. Unlike the home's other woodwork, this door was unvarnished, its pine surface rough and splintered. The keyhole was tarnished, almost black. She retrieved the key ring from the parlor and began trying keys in the lock. On the seventh attempt, one slid in smoothly, but wouldn't turn. As she jiggled it, a child's voice whispered directly beside her ear, "You don't want to go down there." Margaret whirled around, dropping the keys with a clatter. The foyer was empty. Sunlight still filtered through the stained glass transom above the front door, illuminating dust motes that swirled in agitated patterns as if disturbed by someone running past. "This is absurd," Margaret muttered, retrieving the keys with trembling hands. "I'm allowing that superstitious woman to affect my nerves." She returned to the parlor and poured herself a small glass of sherry from a crystal decanter. As she sipped it, she noticed a photograph album on a bookshelf she hadn't examined before. Pulling it down, she began to flip through images of the Robinson family through the decades. The final pages showed Edward at various ages, as an infant in his mother's arms, as a toddler clutching a wooden horse, as a solemn schoolboy. In the last photograph, taken perhaps a year before his death, he stood in the garden beside a small girl about his age. They were holding hands, the girl's face turned slightly away from the camera. Margaret squinted at the faded image. There was something familiar about the girl's profile, though she couldn't place it. She turned the page, but the rest of the album was empty. As dusk deepened into night, Margaret prepared a simple dinner from the provisions Mrs. Jenkins had left. The kitchen felt colder than the rest of the house, despite the lingering heat of the day. Twice she thought she heard footsteps overhead, though she knew she was alone. After eating, Margaret decided to retire early with a book from the library. As she climbed the stairs, a soft thump came from the third floor, like something being dropped. She paused, looking up at the ceiling. "Hello," she called, her voice sounding thin in the vast emptiness of the house. A giggle answered her, not one child but several, followed by the unmistakable sound of running feet. Margaret hurried up to the second-floor landing and approached the narrow staircase leading to the third floor. The door at the top was still locked, yet beneath it a thin line of light glowed where none should be. Heart-pounding, she climbed the steps and pressed her ear to the wood. Children's voices murmured on the other side, too faint to make out words. Then a woman's voice joined them, soft, melodic, singing a lullaby Margaret recognized from her own childhood. "Who's up there?" she demanded, rattling the doorknob. "This is my house now. I demand you show yourselves." The singing stopped abruptly. The light beneath the door vanished. In the sudden silence, Margaret became aware of a presence behind her. She turned slowly. At the bottom of the servants' staircase stood a small figure in a sailor suit, his face obscured by shadows. "Edward," she whispered. The figure took a step backward, then another, moving toward the door beneath the main staircase. It raised a small hand, beckoning. Against every instinct screaming for her to flee upstairs, Margaret descended the steps and followed the child's silhouette across the foyer. At the mysterious door, the figure stopped and pointed insistently. Margaret fumbled with the key ring, finding the key that had almost worked earlier. This time, it turned smoothly in the lock. The door swung open, revealing a set of stone steps disappearing into darkness. Cold air rushed up from below, carrying the scent of damp earth and something sickly sweet beneath it. From the blackness came the sound of children, not laughing now, but weeping. The small figure beside her had vanished. Margaret stood alone at the top of the stairs, staring into a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the light from her lamp. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing back in a way that suggested a space much larger than a simple storage cellar. "Is someone down there?" Only the weeping answered her, growing more desperate, more pleading. Margaret placed her foot on the first step. The stone steps spiraled downward, each one slightly uneven, as if worn by centuries of use. Margaret's lamp cast grotesque shadows on the rough walls, shadows that seemed to move independently of her cautious descent. The weeping grew louder, punctuated by whispered pleas. "Help us. Don't leave us here. We're so cold." At the bottom of the stairs, Margaret found herself in a cavernous cellar that extended far beyond what should have been the foundation of the house. Massive stone pillars supported the ceiling, disappearing into darkness at the edges of her lamp's glow. The floor was packed earth, damp and uneven. "Hello!" she called again, turning in a slow circle. "Where are you?" Her light fell upon a wooden door set into the far wall, its surface covered with strange symbols carved into the wood. As she approached, the weeping abruptly stopped. Margaret reached for the iron handle, but hesitated. Something felt wrong, not just the unnatural cold or the inexplicable size of the cellar, but a deep instinct warning her not to proceed. "Margaret," a woman's voice called from behind the door, familiar yet impossible to place. "We've been waiting for you." "Who are you?" Margaret pressed her palm against the rough wood. "How do you know my name?" "We're family." The voice sounded closer now, as if the speaker stood just on the other side. "We've always been here, waiting for a Robinson to hear us." A child's hand, small, pale and ice-cold, slipped into Margaret's free hand. She looked down to see a little girl in a white nightgown, her features hauntingly similar to the girl in Edward's photograph. Up close, the resemblance to Margaret's own childhood face was unmistakable. "You need to open it," the girl said, her voice echoing strangely. "We can't do it ourselves. We've tried for so long." Margaret pulled her hand away. "Who are you? What is this place?" The girl's expression changed, her eyes darkening. "Don't you remember, Margaret? You used to play with us before they took you away." Fragments of memories surfaced in Margaret's mind. Summers spent in Mobile as a child, before her parents' divorce, before her mother took her to Boston, never to return. She remembered a secret game in this very cellar, children holding hands in a circle, candles guttering in the draught. "This isn't possible," Margaret whispered, backing away. "I was just a child. That was 20 years ago. Time is different for us." The girl followed, her bare feet leaving no impressions in the damp earth. "We've been waiting so patiently. Uncle Charles wouldn't help us, even when Edward joined our games. But you will, won't you, Margaret? You always kept your promises." From behind the door came a chorus of children's voices, calling Margaret's name, begging to be released. The wooden surface began to bulge outward, as if something were pressing against it. "Just turn the handle," the girl urged, her eyes now completely black. "Let us out, Margaret. Let us go home." Margaret stumbled backward, clutching her lamp. "You're not real. None of this is real." The girl's face contorted with rage, her features blurring into something inhuman. "We are as real as you!" she shrieked, her voice no longer childlike but ancient, guttural. Margaret turned and fled toward the stairs, the lamp swinging wildly in her grasp. Behind her, the wooden door began to splinter, the carved symbols glowing with an unearthly blue light. Dozens of small hands reached through the widening cracks, grasping at empty air. She took the steps two at a time, the anguished wails of the children following her upward. At the top, she slammed the door shut and turned the key, which instantly grew so cold it burned her fingers. Margaret collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. Through the door came a final whisper, so faint she almost missed it. "We'll find another way out, Margaret. We always do." The grandfather clock struck midnight, though it had been barely 9 when she descended. Margaret sat motionless in the foyer until dawn broke, her eyes fixed on the door beneath the stairs, listening to the muffled sounds of children playing a game she almost remembered. When Mrs. Jenkins arrived the next morning, she took one look at Margaret's pale face and bloodshot eyes, and immediately set about brewing strong coffee. "You went down there, didn't you?" she asked, setting a steaming cup before Margaret at the kitchen table, "after I expressly warned you not to." Margaret wrapped her trembling hands around the warm porcelain. "What's happening in this house, Mrs. Jenkins? Who are those children?" The housekeeper sighed heavily, sinking into a chair opposite Margaret. "I was hoping you'd sell the house without asking questions, that you'd leave before—" "Before what?" Margaret demanded. "I have a right to know." Mrs. Jenkins nodded reluctantly. "Yes, I suppose you do. You're a Robinson after all." She leaned closer, lowering her voice though they were alone. "Your grandfather, Augustus Robinson, made his fortune in shipping, but there were rumors, dark rumors, about how he acquired his wealth so quickly." "What kind of rumors?" "They said he practiced certain rituals, brought back forbidden knowledge from his voyages to Africa and the Caribbean. The sort of things God-fearing folks don't speak of." Mrs. Jenkins crossed herself. "When he built this house in 1887, people noticed children going missing in the surrounding neighborhoods." Margaret's coffee turned bitter in her mouth. "Are you suggesting my grandfather was responsible?" "I'm not suggesting anything, ma'am. I'm telling you what folks whispered." Mrs. Jenkins glanced nervously at the ceiling. "They say this house was built on blood, that the children Augustus took were sealed into the foundation to feed whatever he'd made a pact with. That's monstrous and completely implausible." Mrs. Jenkins shrugged. "Believe what you will, but answer me this. What did you see down there last night?" Margaret couldn't bring herself to describe the door, the girl with her own face, the reaching hands. Instead, she asked, "Did my uncle know about this?" Mr. Charles inherited his father's books, his journals. He knew everything. Mrs. Jenkins's voice hardened, and it destroyed him after Master Edward and Mrs. Eliza passed. He became obsessed with bringing them back, spent hours in that cellar performing who knows what rituals. And did he bring them back? A shadow crossed the housekeeper's face. "Not in the way he hoped. I heard them at night, Edward laughing, Mrs. Eliza singing. But they weren't alone, and they weren't right." After Mrs. Jenkins left to do the marketing, Margaret climbed the main staircase to the second floor, then followed the servants' stairs to the locked third-floor door. Using the key ring, she found one that worked and entered a long attic space that ran the length of the house. Trunks and furniture filled one end, while the other had been converted into what appeared to be a study. A desk beneath a dormer window, bookshelves lining the walls, an old armchair beside a cold fireplace. This must have been Uncle Charles's sanctuary during his final years. Margaret approached the desk, where leather-bound journals were stacked beside an oil lamp. She opened the most recent volume, dated 1920, and began to read. April 17th. Edward appeared again tonight. He looks just as he did before the fever took him, but his eyes. Something else looks out through my boy's eyes. When I asked where Eliza was, he said, "Mama can't come up yet. She's still teaching the others to sing." I asked what others, but he just laughed and ran into the shadows. May 3rd, found another symbol carved into the cellar door. They're getting stronger. Mrs. Jenkins refuses to enter the house after sunset, says she heard children singing in the walls last night. I told her it was just the pipes. June 10th. Edward brought a friend tonight, a little girl in a white nightgown. She looked familiar, though I can't place her. When I approached them, they fled downstairs. I followed, but couldn't bring myself to open the cellar door. Whatever waits on the other side is not my son, no matter how it appears. Margaret flipped forward several months. November 28th. I understand now. The girl is Margaret, my brother's child who visited those summers before the war, but that's impossible. Margaret is alive, grown now, living in Boston. I saw her wedding announcement in the paper 3 years ago. And yet, the child I see playing with Edward is unmistakably her. It makes me question, who exactly did my father welcome into this house? December 25th, Christmas without family. The children sang carols all night from behind the cellar door. I nearly opened it. God forgive me, I nearly did. The final entry, dated February 2nd, 1921, just days before Charles's death, was written in a shaky, almost illegible hand. They found another way, not through the door. They're using the mirrors, the windows, any reflective surface. Edward stood at the foot of my bed last night, but when I reached for him, my hands passed through empty air. "We just want to come home," he said. "Why won't you let us come home, Papa?" I've failed them. Failed them all. Margaret is coming. Perhaps she will be stronger than I was. Perhaps she will understand what must be done. The journal slipped from Margaret's numb fingers. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the attic floor. In the dimness, she thought she saw movement. Children darting between trunks, playing an eternal game of hide and seek. "I know you're there," she whispered. "What do you want from me?" A voice whispered back from everywhere and nowhere. "To finish what began long ago." That night, Margaret covered every mirror in the house with sheets, closed all the curtains, and even turned picture frames to face the walls. If what Uncle Charles had written was true, the entities weren't limited to the cellar anymore. They could manifest through any reflective surface. She'd sent a telegram to Richard that afternoon, asking him to come immediately. The earliest he could arrive was in 3 days. Until then, she was determined to uncover the truth about what haunted the Robinson home. After securing the house, Margaret returned to the attic study with a kerosene lamp and began systematically examining Uncle Charles's papers. In a locked drawer of the desk, she found a much older journal, this one belonging to her grandfather, Augustus Robinson. The leather cover was cracked with age, the pages yellowed and brittle. Margaret opened it carefully, finding entries dating back to 1882, 5 years before the house was built. October 12, 1882, Port-au-Prince, met with the Beaucourt today. The ritual he described is abominable, yet the power he promises. No European banking house could refuse me with such leverage. The cost is high, but what empire was built without sacrifice? November 30th, 1882, at sea. The crew grows suspicious of the cargo in the sealed hold. 6 children purchased from a plantation owner outside Port-au-Prince. They do not understand the necessity. What are a few foreign lives weighed against the dynasty I will build? Margaret felt physically ill as she continued reading. Her grandfather described in clinical detail how he'd incorporated the vessels into the foundation of his new home in Mobile, how he'd performed the ritual on the night of a lunar eclipse in 1887. May 7th, 1887. The binding is complete. The entity accepts my offering and the terms of our arrangement. 30 years of prosperity and influence, after which a new sacrifice will be required. By then, my sons will be prepared to continue the pact. The vessels remain conscious, as the ritual requires. Their essences fuel the binding. Their weeping is an irritation, but I've ordered additional insulation installed in the walls. Margaret slammed the journal shut, bile rising in her throat. Her family's fortune, her inheritance, had been built on unimaginable cruelty. But what had gone wrong? According to Augustus's timeline, the pact would have required renewal in 1917, just before Edward and Eliza died in the influenza outbreak. She reopened Charles's journal, searching for entries from that period. In January 1917, he wrote, "Father's associates visited today, reminding me of family obligations coming due this year. I sent them away. Whatever bargain he made, I want no part of it. The fortune is substantial enough without resorting to such measures." And later that year, November 18th, strange sounds from the cellar. "The door was open this morning, though I'm certain I locked it last night. Eliza complains of children crying in the walls, keeping Edward awake. I've told her it's just the house settling." Margaret pieced together the terrible narrative. Her uncle had refused to renew Augustus's pact, and the entity had claimed his wife and son as payment. In his grief, Charles had attempted to reclaim them through the same dark arts his father had practiced, only to discover the terrible truth that Edward and Eliza had joined the original vessels, trapped between worlds. As she returned the journals to the drawer, Margaret noticed a folded blueprint of the house. Opening it on the desk, she saw handwritten annotations marking hidden passages behind walls, under floors, and a tunnel leading from the cellar to an old well in the garden near the family cemetery. The well wasn't visible anymore. It must have been sealed or covered over decades ago. But if there was another entrance to whatever lay beneath the house, a soft tapping interrupted her thoughts. Margaret froze, listening. The sound came again, fingernails against glass. She turned slowly toward the dormer window. A child's handprint appeared on the fogged glass, though there was no ledge outside, nothing for anyone to stand on 3 stories above the ground. The handprint was followed by another, then another, until the entire window was covered with small, desperate impressions. "Let us in," came the whispered chorus from beyond the glass. "We're so cold out here, Margaret." The lamp flickered, casting wild shadows across the attic walls. In those shadows, Margaret saw impossible things. Children crawling across the ceiling, emerging from corners that should have been empty, their movements jerky and inhuman. "You're not Edward," she said, backing toward the door. "You're not any of them. What are you?" The shadows stilled. The temperature in the attic plummeted until Margaret's breath clouded before her face. From every darkened corner came a single unified voice. "We are hunger. We are patience. We are the price of Robinson ambition." The lamp went out. In the perfect darkness, small, cold hands found Margaret's arms, her shoulders, her hair. They didn't grab or pull, they simply touched, as if remembering what human warmth felt like. Margaret screamed and fled, stumbling down the servants' stairs. Behind her, children's laughter echoed through the house, growing louder as she reached the second-floor landing. She slammed her bedroom door and wedged a chair beneath the handle, though she knew it would provide little protection against what haunted the house. Through the door, she heard them, playing in the hallway, running up and down the stairs, calling her name in sing-song voices. "Margaret, come play with us. Margaret, set us free." She pressed her hands over her ears, but the voices continued inside her head. As the grandfather clock struck midnight, the children fell silent. In the sudden quiet, a familiar voice spoke directly beside her. "They're lying to you, Margaret." She lowered her hands and turned to find Edward sitting at the foot of her bed, looking exactly as he did in the last photograph. Solemn eyes, sailor suit, neatly combed hair. "They promised to bring us back," he said, his voice eerily normal. "But they can't. They can only pretend to be us, wear us like masks. The real Edward, the real Eliza. We're still here, trapped. And they're getting hungrier." "What do they want?" Margaret whispered. Edward's expression remained unchanged, but a single tear tracked down his pale cheek. "What they've always wanted. More vessels. More life to consume. How do I stop them?" "You can't," the boy said simply. "No one can. But you can free us, Margaret. All of us. We've been waiting so long." "How?" Edward smiled then, a smile too wide for a human face, stretching until it split his cheeks. Break the binding. Burn it all down. Dawn brought temporary relief. The voices ceased, the unnatural cold dissipated, and Margaret could almost convince herself she'd experienced an elaborate nightmare, if not for the child-sized handprints still visible on every window and mirror in the house. Mrs. Jenkins arrived at 8, looking more haggard than usual. She glanced at Margaret's dishevelled appearance, the dark circles beneath her eyes, but said nothing as she prepared breakfast. "I found my grandfather's journal," Margaret said after several minutes of tense silence. "I know what he did." The housekeeper paused in her work, shoulders slumping. "Then you understand why this house can never know peace." The blueprint showed a tunnel from the cellar to an old well in the garden. "Is it still there?" Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. "Mr. Charles had it filled with concrete in 1919 after—" She hesitated. "After he found Edward trying to climb down it one night, claiming his mother was calling him from below." Margaret pushed her untouched breakfast away. "I need to end this, Mrs. Jenkins. Not just for my sake, but for all of them. Edward, Eliza, the children my grandfather sacrificed. They're still conscious, still suffering after all these years. And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Mrs. Jenkins asked skeptically. "Edward, or whatever spoke to me through him, mentioned breaking the binding." Mrs. Jenkins's expression hardened. "That thing isn't Master Edward. Don't let it deceive you." "I know," Margaret said quietly, "but what if there is a way to free them, to finally let them rest?" The housekeeper studied her for a long moment. "There are stories, old stories from before the war, about a woman who practiced root work, conjure magic, over in Africa town. They say she fought against the same sort of darkness your grandfather brought into this house. Is she still alive?" "Her granddaughter carries on the work. Her name is Bessie Harlow. She doesn't advertise her services for obvious reasons, but folks who need her know how to find her." Mrs. Jenkins wrote an address on a scrap of paper. "Tell her I sent you. And Mrs. Robinson, be careful who you trust in that house tonight. Not all voices belong to the hungry ones. Some are just lost souls caught in the trap." After Mrs. Jenkins left, Margaret walked the grounds, studying the area where the well should have been according to the blueprint. Near the family cemetery, she found a circular concrete cap about 4 feet in diameter, partially hidden by overgrown jasmine. Kneeling beside it, Margaret placed her palm against the rough surface. The concrete felt unusually cold despite the July heat. As she leaned closer, she heard a faint sound emanating from beneath, not children this time, but water, flowing water, where there should have been none. That afternoon, Margaret took a taxi to the address Mrs. Jenkins had provided. Bessie Harlow lived in a modest shotgun house on the outskirts of Africa Town, a community founded by the last known shipment of enslaved Africans brought illegally to America aboard the Clotilda in 1860. A woman in her 40s answered the door, her dark eyes evaluating Margaret thoroughly before she spoke. "Mrs. Robinson, I presume? Mabel Jenkins said you might come." She stepped aside. "I'm Bessie Harlow." The interior of the shotgun house was immaculate, with worn but polished furniture and dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. The air smelled of sage and something sweeter Margaret couldn't identify. "Thank you for seeing me, Mrs. Harlow." I know why you're here," Bessie interrupted, gesturing for Margaret to sit at a small round table. "The Robinson house has been poisoning Mobile for generations. My grandmother tried to warn people when Augustus first built it." Margaret lowered herself into a chair. "Then you know what's happening there. I know your grandfather made a bargain with something that should have been left undisturbed. I know he fed it innocent lives to gain wealth and power." Bessie lit a candle at the center of the table. "And I know it's still hungry. How do I stop it? How do I free the souls trapped there?" Bessie studied the candle flame. "Breaking such a binding isn't simple, especially one sealed with blood and reinforced over decades. The entity your grandfather summoned exists between worlds. It feeds on the essence of its vessels, keeping them in a state of half-life to maintain its connection to our world. Edward, my cousin, he said to burn it all down. Fire alone won't do it. The binding is anchored to the foundation stones, consecrated with blood. Bessie rose and retrieved a small cloth bag from a cabinet. This contains red brick dust, graveyard dirt, and blessed salt. You must create a circle around the house, then find the source, the heart of the binding. The cellar door? No, that's just one entrance. Look for Augustus's original ritual site. There will be symbols carved into stone, perhaps hidden beneath floorboards or behind walls. And when I find it, you must break the physical symbols while reciting the words I'll teach you. Bessie's expression darkened. But be warned, the entity won't release its vessels willingly. It will use everything against you. Memories, guilt, the faces of those you love. And if you fail, if you let it trick you into stepping beyond the protective circle or opening a path between worlds. It will take me too, Margaret finished. Bessie nodded grimly. And with a living Robinson as its new vessel, nothing would contain its hunger. Margaret returned to the mansion as dusk approached, the cloth bag tucked into her pocket. Bessie's words of unbinding committed to memory. Mrs. Jenkins had left hours earlier, leaving Margaret truly alone with whatever haunted the house. As she approached the front gate, Margaret noticed a peculiar stillness. No birds sang in the oak trees, no insects chirped in the overgrown garden. Even the distant sounds of mobile, carriages, automobiles, shipyard whistles seemed muffled, as if the property existed in a bubble separate from the surrounding world. Before entering, Margaret opened the cloth bag and began creating a circle of the mixed substances around the house's perimeter, just as Bessie had instructed. The task took nearly an hour, and by the time she completed it, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a deep, bruised purple. Inside, the house was unnaturally silent. No children's voices called from dark corners, no phantom footsteps crossed the upstairs hallways. Even the grandfather clock stood frozen at 8:17, its pendulum motionless. Margaret lit every lamp and electric light as she moved through the ground floor, finally stopping at the door beneath the stairs. The key turned easily in the lock, the door swinging open to reveal the stone steps descending into darkness. As she placed her foot on the first step, a voice called from behind her, "Margaret, don't." She turned to find Richard standing in the foyer, still wearing his traveling clothes, his familiar face creased with concern. "Richard, you're not supposed to be here until Friday. I came as soon as I got your telegram." He reached for her hand. "We need to leave now. This house isn't safe." Margaret hesitated, studying her husband's face. Everything seemed right, his voice, his mannerisms, the small scar above his eyebrow from a childhood accident. Then she noticed his shoes were perfectly dry despite the afternoon thunderstorm that had left Mobile's streets muddy and flooded. "You're not Richard," she said quietly. His expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened, pupils expanding until no white remained. "Clever girl, always were the sharpest of the Robinsons." The thing wearing Richard's face stepped closer. "But does it matter? I can be anyone you want. Husband, uncle, the child you lost last spring." Margaret flinched at the mention of her miscarriage, a private grief she'd shared with no one in Mobile. "Yes, we know everything, Margaret. Every secret, every pain." Not Richard's voice softened to a whisper. "We can give it all back to you. The child you never held, the family you never had. All we ask in return is a small space in this world." "You've been asking that for over 30 years, Margaret replied, backing toward the cellar door. "But you never stop at a small space, do you?" The entity smiled with Richard's face. "We are what we are, as are you, a Robinson, born to privilege, built on other people's suffering. Did you think your hands were clean? Every dollar in your accounts, every fine dress in your closet, every advantage you've enjoyed, all purchased with the lives of children." "I didn't know." Margaret whispered. Ignorance is such a convenient shield. Not Richard's form began to blur at the edges, hints of other faces, Edward, Eliza, children Margaret didn't recognize, flickering beneath her husband's features. But now you do know, and knowing, you have a choice. Join us willingly, help us expand our dominion beyond this house, and we'll give you everything you've ever wanted. And if I refuse? The blurred figure shrugged. Then we take what we need, as we always have. It lunged suddenly, moving with impossible speed. Margaret barely managed to duck through the cellar door, slamming it closed behind her. No lock existed on this side, so she descended the stone steps quickly, her lamp casting wild shadows on the walls. The cellar stretched before her, vast and impossibly cold. Margaret moved toward the far wall, where the wooden door with its carved symbols stood partially open, just wide enough for a child to slip through. Beyond the door lay only darkness, but as Margaret approached, she heard the sound of flowing water and smelled the brackish scent of the bay, the tunnel to the well. Margaret hesitated at the threshold of the wooden door. Behind her, the cellar door crashed open, followed by footsteps on the stone stairs, not the quick patter of children, but the measured tread of an adult. Margaret! Her Uncle Charles's voice echoed across the cellar. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. She slipped through the door into a narrow stone passage. Her lamp revealed walls, slick with moisture, the ceiling low enough that she had to stoop. The tunnel sloped gradually downward, the sound of water growing louder with each step. Behind her, more voices joined her uncle's, her grandfather Augustus, whom she'd never met but recognized from portraits. Her father, who'd abandoned the family when she was 12. Richard, calling her name with increasing desperation. They're not real, Margaret whispered to herself, pressing forward. None of them are real. The tunnel opened into a circular chamber directly beneath the well. Water trickled down the stone walls, pooling on the floor before disappearing into a small drain at the center. The chamber was perhaps 15 feet in diameter, its walls covered with symbols identical to those on the wooden door. In the center of the room stood a waist-high stone altar, its surface stained dark with what could only be blood. Carved into its sides was a continuous frieze depicting children being led into the foundation of a house by a tall figure in Victorian dress. Margaret approached the altar, her lamp revealing 5 iron spikes driven into its surface, arranged in a pentagram pattern. From each spike hung a small object. A child's shoe, a lock of hair, a tiny portrait miniature, a baby tooth, and a silver locket. This was it, the heart of the binding, the physical anchors that kept the sacrificed children's spirits trapped between worlds, providing the entity with its foothold in reality. As Margaret raised her hand to touch the first spike, a child's voice spoke from directly behind her. If you free us, you'll free it too. She turned to find the girl in the white nightgown, the one with her own childhood face, standing in the tunnel entrance. What do you mean? The binding works both ways, the girl explained, her expression solemn. It keeps us here, but it also limits what it can do, where it can go. Break the spikes, and we might be released, but so will it, unleashed into your world without constraints. Margaret lowered her hand. Then what can I do? I can't leave you like this. The girl's eyes filled with tears. We've been here so long, some of us don't remember anything else. She stepped closer, her bare feet leaving no impression in the wet stone floor. There is another way, a sacrifice freely given with pure intent. It could transform the binding, not break it, but change it. What kind of sacrifice? The girl pointed to Margaret's heart. A Robinson life, willingly offered. It would bind the entity more completely, sealing it away permanently, and release the other vessels. Margaret took an instinctive step backward. You're asking me to die. I'm asking you to choose, the girl corrected. Your grandfather chose wealth over innocence. Your uncle chose denial over responsibility. What will you choose, Margaret? From the tunnel came the sound of approaching footsteps, dozens of them moving in unnatural synchrony. They're coming, the girl warned. All of them together. They know what you're considering. Margaret glanced at the altar, the iron spikes that anchored both suffering children and hungry entity to her family's house. Bessie's instructions had seemed so clear, but what if the girl was right? What if breaking the binding simply unleashed a greater evil? The footsteps grew louder. At the tunnel entrance appeared a nightmare procession. The forms of her family members, their features distorted and blurred, merging into each other like melting wax. Behind them came the children, eyes completely black, movements jerky and wrong, as if their limbs were being controlled by unseen strings. "Last chance, Margaret," called the thing, wearing her uncle's face. "Join your family in prosperity, or join these vessels in eternal service." Margaret looked at the girl, possibly a manifestation of the entity, possibly a trapped soul, possibly some fragment of truth between worlds. She thought of her grandfather's journal, the casual cruelty with which he'd disposed of young lives for financial gain, the obscene inheritance that had brought her to Mobile. She made her choice. Margaret grabbed the first iron spike and wrenched it free from the stone. A howl rose from the assembled figures, their forms rippling like disturbed water. "You cannot stop us!" they shrieked in unison. "We are bound to Robinson blood." "Then take mine," Margaret said, "and let the others go." She pulled the second spike free, then the third. The chamber began to shake, dirt and small stones raining from the ceiling. Water surged up through the central drain, quickly covering the floor. The entities rushed forward, but seemed unable to cross some invisible threshold into the chamber. They clawed at the air, their borrowed faces contorting with rage and hunger. Margaret removed the fourth spike. The altar cracked down the middle, a deep fissure appearing in the stone floor beneath it. The water was ankle-deep now, rising quickly. As she reached for the final spike, Margaret turned to the girl. "Will this free you? Truly free you?" For a moment the child's face became entirely Margaret's, not as she had been, but as she might have been had her path led elsewhere. "Nothing is certain," the girl said softly, "but it is a choice made with love, not greed. That alone changes everything." Margaret pulled the final spike free. The altar collapsed completely, the stone floor beneath it giving way. Water rushed upward like a geyser, engulfing Margaret in its icy embrace. Through the roaring flood, she heard the entities scream, not in triumph, but in desperation. Their forms dissolved like paper in water, fragments spinning away into the darkness. The chamber walls crumbled, the ceiling collapsed. Margaret felt herself falling, carried downward by the surging water. Above her, impossibly distant, she glimpsed the night sky through the open top of the well. Around her, small hands touched her arms, her face, not grasping but guiding, supporting. Children's voices whispered words of gratitude, of release, of final peace. As consciousness faded, Margaret heard her cousin Edward's voice, clear and truly childlike for the first time. "Thank you for bringing us home." 3 days later, Richard Robinson arrived in Mobile to find the grand Victorian mansion at the end of Old Dauphin Way partially collapsed. Emergency crews surrounded the property, pumping water from a massive sinkhole that had opened beneath the structure's foundation. "What happened?" he asked a policeman manning the barricade. "My wife was staying here, Margaret Robinson." The officer's expression turned sympathetic. "You'd better speak with Mr. Hayes, sir. He's been handling the situation." William Hayes was directing workers at the edge of the property. When he saw Richard, he approached with visible relief. "Mr. Robinson, thank God you're here. We've been trying to reach you." "Where's Margaret?" Richard demanded. "Is she all right?" Hayes led him away from the noise of the pumps and machinery. 3 nights ago, a portion of the house collapsed into what appears to be an extensive network of tunnels beneath the property. We believe they date back to Civil War times, possibly part of the Underground Railroad, weakened by recent heavy rains. But Margaret, Mrs. Jenkins found her the following morning, Mr. Robinson. Hayes placed a steadying hand on Richard's arm. She was in the garden, unconscious but alive, soaked to the skin despite there having been no rain that night. Richard sagged with relief. "Where is she now?" Providence Hospital. The doctors say physically she'll recover, but Hayes hesitated. She's been unresponsive since they found her. She appears to hear and understand, but she hasn't spoken or acknowledged anyone. At the hospital, Richard found his wife sitting in a chair by the window, gazing out at Mobile Bay. Her face was pale, her dark hair pulled back in a simple braid. She looked thin, almost translucent in the afternoon light. "Margaret," he whispered, kneeling beside her. "It's me, Richard." She turned slowly, her eyes focusing on his face with an intensity that made him shiver. For a long moment, she studied him as if committing every feature to memory. "Richard," she finally said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "You're late." He laughed with relief, taking her hands in his. The trains were delayed in Atlanta. "Margaret, what happened at the house?" "Hayes said there was some kind of collapse." "The house is gone?" she asked. "Not entirely. The east wing is still standing, but the foundation is compromised. They're saying the whole structure will have to be demolished." Richard squeezed her hands. "It doesn't matter. We'll sell the property and go home to Boston." Margaret turned back to the window. "They're free now," she murmured. "Who is?" "The children, Edward, all of them." She looked at Richard again, her eyes clearer now. "I made a choice, Richard. I chose to end it, not continue it. The doctors had warned Richard she might be confused, might speak in ways that made no sense. A result of the trauma, they said. "Of course you did, darling," he said soothingly. "And now we can go home." Margaret shook her head. "Not yet. There's something I need to do first." 2 days later, Margaret stood before 6 new gravestones in the Robinson family cemetery. The rest of the property had been cordoned off, the house deemed too dangerous to enter, but Hayes had arranged for her brief visit to this corner of the garden. The stones were simple marble markers, each bearing only a first name, and the date, 1887. Bessie Harlow stood beside Margaret, her hand resting lightly on the younger woman's arm. "You did what generations of Robinsons could not," Bessie said quietly. "You chose atonement over power." "I'm not sure I had much choice," Margaret replied. "Once I knew the truth. There's always a choice. Your grandfather knew the truth from the beginning." Bessie studied the markers. "These children can rest now. The binding is broken. And the entity? Gone back to where it came from. Or perhaps transformed by your sacrifice." Bessie turned to face Margaret. "Either way, its connection to this world is severed. The Robinson line is free of its influence." Margaret touched the smallest gravestone. "I hear them sometimes in my dreams. Not crying or pleading anymore. Laughing, playing, the way children should. That will fade with time," Bessie assured her, "though you might always be more sensitive to the spaces between worlds." As they walked back toward the waiting automobile where Richard sat impatiently, Margaret paused at the concrete cap covering the old well. Deep cracks ran through its surface, but it remained intact. "I still don't understand how I survived," she said. "The chamber collapsed. I was underwater." Bessie smiled enigmatically. "Perhaps the children you freed returned the favor, or perhaps the binding's transformation spared you, recognizing your willing sacrifice." "We're putting the property up for sale," Margaret said. "But who would buy it, knowing its history?" "History can be rewritten," Bessie replied. "Isn't that what your family has always done? But this time, perhaps the rewriting can serve truth rather than conceal it." Later that afternoon, in Hayes's office, Margaret signed the final papers transferring ownership of the Robinson estate to a newly established trust. The property would be cleared, the house demolished, and a children's park created in its place, funded by the substantial Robinson fortune, which would also endow a home for orphaned and abandoned children on Mobile's east side. "Your uncle might not have approved of this disposition of his assets," Hayes commented as Margaret handed him the signed documents. "No, he wouldn't have," she agreed. "But I'm not my uncle or my grandfather." That night, as the train pulled away from Mobile's Union Station, Margaret watched the city lights recede into darkness. Beside her, Richard slept peacefully, untroubled by the weight of family history or the whispers of children in the walls. Margaret pressed her palm against the cool glass of the window, remembering the feel of small hands guiding her through dark water. In the reflection, she thought she glimpsed a girl in a white nightgown, smiling with a face that might have been her own. "Goodbye," Margaret whispered as the apparition faded. The train rounded a curve, and Mobile disappeared from view. Ahead lay Boston, a future free from the shadows of the past. Behind remained a foundation built on blood, now transformed into something that might, with time and care, begin to heal the wounds inflicted by Robinson ambition. Margaret closed her eyes, listening not for ghostly voices, but for the steady rhythm of the train carrying her home. For the first time since arriving in Mobile, she slept without dreaming of children's laughter in a house where none lived.